Good afternoon, students. This is Mr. Verzat, and today we're going to look a little deeper into landscape technique called atmospheric perspective. Now, what is it? Well, it creates an illusion of depth, an illusion of volume and space in your piece. It's another way to do it. And since you've already learned contrast, you've already learned the basics of value, this is actually going to be cake for you guys, probably. Basically, atmospheric perspective, let's break down the word. The atmosphere is the air that surrounds us. Perspective is where we're looking in something. So naturally, atmospheric perspective is the illusion of depth created by making things look as if they're going into a fog. That just means things that are close up are very, very detailed and very bold, and there's lots of high contrast in that. And things that are further and further away, as they get further away, get lighter, less detailed, and the contrast goes down. That gives the illusion that there's some depth going on in there. So let's just take a look at this picture in the middle right here. You'll have actually seen this, or will be seeing this picture again in landscape. What we've got going on here is we've got a foreground right in our face. It's that really dark silhouetted tree line right here at the bottom. And we have several overlapping plains, overlapping hills. And as they get further away, get lighter and lighter. And not only do they get lighter, but if we look at the second hill behind the tree line, we see trees. All right, if we look at the next hill behind that, they get lighter. We can still kind of make out some details, some textures as if there are trees there. But as you start getting to the third and fourth and fifth hills, it starts to get foggy. You can't make out the tree lines anymore. They start to look like sheer surfaces. You don't see the tree texture anymore. And so that's an example of where the detail is disappearing the further away things get. And that's just the basics of atmospheric perspective. You can carry that over into several areas: photography, line drawing. So let's just kind of break it down into pieces. How do you do it? Well, you increase the contrast for things that are closer. The next step is to decrease the amount of detail the further away things are. As things disappear, you need to do that in steps. You don't want to just abruptly have lots of detail in the front and then bam, no detail on your forms. You need to do that in increments, in steps. That gives it kind of a more natural transition into a volume or a space. Make things lighter the further away they go. Now, our atmosphere, we can see this in everyday nature, and you'll see that in some examples ahead. You know, the further away mountains get, they get kind of a bluish color, especially if you're in an area with smog, like, say, Los Angeles. Sometimes you can't even see the Hollywood sign off in the distance. The smog gets so bad. So atmosphere lightens things. It reduces the detail, the contrast, and it makes things lighter. And then finally, if you're going to make a contour line drawing, make those contour lines start to break up. Make them get kind of thinner the further away they get. Maybe your contour lines don't connect. Now, the thing about atmospheric perspective, I haven't taught it to you yet, but it's actually one of the most basic tenets of any form of art or design, whether it's digital art, drawing, painting, and so on. It's a very basic concept, something that's just a natural part of art and design. So this is one of those things you need to digest and always be mindful of when you're creating an image that has volume or space. Otherwise, it just kind of looks weird, and you'll see that in the non-example. All right, here's an example of a caricature, a drawing of a person like a portrait, only they're done in an exaggerated manner, you know, mainly for humor or fun, kind of like a cartoon. Well, in this caricature, we've got a person giving a whole bunch of kids a piggyback ride. And if you notice, he is the part of the piece that's important. He's the focal point of it. Now, all the rest is just icing on the cake. Notice how the tower gets narrower and thinner. The detail starts to drop. The line work starts to get lighter. And on top of that, if we zoom in really close, I don't connect my lines. They start to, like in this area right here, I didn't connect any of my line work. That's to show it kind of getting foggy and things starting to break up when there's more atmosphere between us and them. So the line work is very bold in the foreground, very detailed, but the further and further and further away things get, not only do they get smaller, but less detailed. See, I switched from having actual features on these kids right here to just general shapes and forms with value, shading, and so on. And on and on and on until it becomes just kind of an incoherent mass of weirdness that disappears off into the distance. You can still understand they're people by looking at it, but you don't need all the detail. That's what we call suggesting the form, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But that's an example of how that applies to line drawings, like contour lines, and drawings like cartoons, comic book figures, and the like. Now over here in this non-example, this is a black and white image of a painting that a student did that lacks atmospheric perspective, and in fact it was a lesson on atmospheric perspective. Zooming in, let's take a look at it. We've got a planetoid surface on the bottom, several flying saucers, and what appears to be a planet in the upper corner, and maybe a sun or another planet in the left side, obscured by some hazy nebula or cloud-like images. So if we were to look at it, it does accomplish one part of atmospheric perspective, and that is that detail disappears as it goes. As you can see, on the bottom of this flying saucer, we see some ripples underneath it, some ridges, but we don't see that in the other flying saucers. That accomplishes it. Also, the saucers are scaled to give kind of a sense of difference. That's all it has in it as far as distance, but there is no atmospheric perspective beyond that. As you can see, every plane in it, from the ground to the flying saucers to the nebulas in the back, it all has the same intensity. It's got the same contrast. It lacks this over here. Notice how on the bottom it's very intense up close, but as things get further and further away and recede, not only the details get less and less, but it gets lighter and lighter, and there's lesser and lesser contrast. Now let's talk detail. Not counting the underside of the flying saucers, the detail on the ground would have been an excellent way to capture a sense of atmospheric perspective and volume. A planetoid surface like the moon has craters, and there are a couple of craters drawn here, but they're all on the same plane, and they abruptly end. There are no other craters off in the distance that slowly not only get smaller, but get less and less detailed. That would have greatly helped this student. Likewise, there's no value on the surface. It's pure contour lines and line art. So what the student could have done would be to decrease the contrast in everything the further away it gets. Even in outer space, you don't have to have a solid black background. In space, you can have things that get in the way of it, nebulas, comets, and so on. He could have decreased the contrast and intensity of the flying saucers, added a little bit more white to the paint. Some receding detail off in the distance would have greatly helped. Likewise, some stars that would be of different sizes, some small, some big, would have greatly helped as well. I'm going to show you guys a wide variety of different images. This is one that's purely line art, and what we've got is an example of atmospheric perspective as it applies to detail only. Now granted, all the planes that recede off in the distance are the exact same intensity, but detail is the main purpose of this one. It's a mechanical, it's a fighter ship doing a strafing run down the side of a space battleship with rockets. We see the explosions off in the distance are scaled smaller than the ones up front. We see more detail in the explosions. Likewise, in all these panels here, they get smaller and smaller, and there's less and less and less detail. And if we look and zoom in here, notice the line work on the panels right in this area. The line work is thinner, and the panels start to break apart. We don't see as much detail in the distance. That's an example of atmospheric perspective as it applies to detail. Alright, here's another creepy one. This is another one I did in three-point perspective. This is where you're looking down, and you also get to see both sides of the form that you're looking at. This is a monster devouring a city, and we're up in a high-rise building watching this. So let's look again at detail and the way that we can give the illusion of depth in intensity and value. So if we look at the side of this building here, we see that it's shaded, but the further away it gets, notice the sides of the other buildings. They're not as dark. The shading, the value, the contrast starts to drop the further away it gets. Likewise, look at these buildings off in the distance. There's no value added to them at all. Now here's a great example of atmospheric perspective as it applies to value and intensity. Look how high the contrast is on this cliff face. We've got very dark darks, we've got very light lights, and likewise plenty of value in between. But look, off in the distance, things are kind of washed out. The contrast starts to diminish. It's very far away. That means there's lots of air between the photographer and the distance, the hills off in the distance. So it starts to take kind of a bluish tint, almost like a fog. And if we look way over here, we can't really make out much detail in the cliffs anymore. So that's an example on how you can have atmospheric perspective, not only reduce detail, but lower the intensity of things as they get further away. Underwater is a great way to show atmospheric perspective. It's murky, it's cloudy, there are things floating around in there. So look, in the foreground here we've got coral. We also have the main focus of the piece, which is the roof of the water and this environment here. And off in the background we've got just the outline of some more coral and then just light blue for the ocean. But notice, the detail drops dramatically. And as things get further away, they become less defined and, in a sense, become just these planes of odd-looking overlapping shapes. So that's another example of atmospheric perspective, as if you're looking through a fog. Here's an example of atmospheric perspective where you want the fog to actually be part of the image. So in the foreground, we've got once again, very high contrast, high detail, but notice they have some fog obscuring parts of the trees. These trees that are closer, right here, these are a lot bolder than these here, but when I say there's fog in there, notice how they do it. They only put it near the base of the trees. As the trees started to climb, the fog wasn't very visible there. So that's another way how you can take atmospheric perspective and turn it into an actual element in your piece. Now, not only is this a great example of how you can achieve volume and depth by overlapping your forms, once again that just means having one form that's closer, obscuring another form behind it, and so on and so forth. But also, this is a great example of showing several receding planes off in the distance that get lighter and lighter. So this hill is far bolder, and there's far much more variety and color on it, and detail and contrast. The contrast starts to drop the further away you get. It starts to get misty and shady, and before you know it, you don't see any detail in the hills. It kind of starts to merge into just one solid mass off in the distance. And the hills begin to take the color of the sky, of the very atmosphere. It's a blue sky, and so the hills start shading off into the blue spectrum. And finally, here's a great example of both detail and atmosphere. We've got high detail on all the buildings in the foreground, but as it gets further away, not only does the detail start to get less and less because you can't see it, it gets hazy because it's a city and there's smog. So the plains out here where the buildings are at, they're lighter in value than the areas up here. So I hope this helped. It's a great way to achieve depth in your piece. So in summary, things that are close to you are very detailed. They're also in high contrast. They have a wider range of value in them. The further away things get from you, the lighter they get, the lower the detail, and the lower the contrast. Finally, once they get way off in the distance, you don't really see much detail. They turn into actual forms or planes on their own. If you're coloring or painting, one of the ways that you can show this is to bring the color of the sky into the color of the object that you're actually drawing that's furthest away. So atmospheric perspective, basic part of art, just like using an eraser or a pencil. Try to digest it and put it in as part of your tool shed, your repertoire of skills. So I look forward to seeing you in class, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.